Okay, well, hello, Kate, and thank you very much for talking to Dark Matter.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
How did you become a writer?
Well, I've always wanted to be a writer. I've never wanted to do anything else. So I began writing when I was, just a little kid. Pretty much as soon as I could hold a pencil, I was writing. So I was writing poems and stories and novels and things right from the age of 7 upwards. And I first sent out a manuscript to a publisher when I was about 17. And I sent it, on a handwritten foolscap paper torn out of my school notebook. So it was very much an amateur kind of effort. But they sent me back a lovely letter, and basically they knew that they were talking to a kid, and just said, you obviously have talent, keep on writing. So all through my 20s, I went to university and I worked as a journalist and in PR. And I just kept on writing poems, stories, and novels. And gradually, I was getting, more and more published. My novel took me till I was 29 or 30, and to get my first big publishing break. And I've been a full-time writer ever since then.
Great. Who's encouraged you along the way?
Well, I had a lot of encouragement from my family. I come from a family of writers and readers. I grew up in a big house that was just crammed full of books, thousands and thousands of books. We were always allowed to read pretty much whatever we wanted. So I had quite a wide, reading diet. Both my sister and my brother are writers as well. They've both been published. And so we used to spend our childhood writing plays and putting them on, writing poems, making up stories, playing together, in a very imaginative sort of a way. At school, I was very much encouraged by my teachers. I remember I wrote a novel for a school project when I was about 9 or 10, and my teacher wrote this lovely comment on it going, "Oh, Kate, you write extremely well for your age. Keep on writing, and I hope you'll be published one day." And it was much the same during my high school years. All I really ever did was write and read, write and read.
Wonderful. What books and authors have influenced you?
So many that it's quite hard for me to list. As a child, my favourite writers were people like C.S. Lewis, Enid Blyton. I love The Hobbit. I love Susan Cooper. I love Lloyd Alexander. I loved Elizabeth Goudge and The Little White Horse. I loved Joan Aiken, Nicholas Stewart Gray. I basically read everything. I mean, by the time I finished primary school, I had read every single book in the library, and so I would just go along and find any book I hadn't read. I would take out and read. As I was going through my teenage years, I began to discover Shakespeare and Jane Austen and the Bronte sisters and poetry. I've always loved poetry. Always have written a lot of poetry, not altogether successfully, but I love to write it. And I've just been the same ever since, as reading very, very voraciously. I read quite widely, so I love fantasy, I love historical fiction, I love crime and murder mysteries, I love thrillers, I love children's literature, and I read a lot of children's books. I will pretty much read anything, actually.
Great. Are there any other media that have influenced you, like TV or computer games?
Not really, because when I was a kid, we weren't allowed to watch TV at all, which made it hard to kind of join in conversations in the school playground because everyone else were watching all these cartoons that we weren't allowed to watch. But I do think it was quite influential in that we had to make our own entertainment. I love movies, and I go to the movies a lot, but I'm not a big TV watcher now either. I tend to work when other people watch TV.
Yes. You mentioned writing poetry. You've actually published a fair amount of poetry.
I have. I've been published internationally in various different magazines. Plus, I've had a collection of poems published, which was, a long-held dream of mine. So I'm very proud of that. My husband jokes that I'm one of the top-selling poets in Australia because I have sold a few copies, but I think it's a little bit there. It's certainly never going to make ought to know. But I write a lot less now than I used to. I think because my books are so filled with songs and chants and curses and spells and my writing is quite lyrical. So I think that all my poetic, endeavours now go into the novels.
You changed your name after you got married. You were Kate Humphrey and now you're Kate Forsyth. Do you think the name change has impacted on your career? Does a rose by any other name smell as sweet?
Um, I don't think so. Um, it was just because I got married the year that my first book was coming out. My first book was called Dragon Claw, and it was part of a series called The Witches of Ilianan, which was a heroic fantasy series which drew upon Scottish history and Scottish folklore. My husband's last name is Forsyth, which is a good Scottish name, and so my publishers just thought that it would be a better name than my maiden name. I was quite well known as a poet and as a journalist under my maiden name. And I did actually have a novel published under my maiden name as well, which was the novel I wrote for my master's thesis. But I don't think it had a huge difference really, except that, F, F for Forsyth does tend to be quite in your eyesight, in your line of sight when you walk into a bookshop. So maybe it helps. Who knows?
You've published your poetry under your maiden name, and your novels are generally under Forsyth. Why have you segregated the works like this?
It was just the way that it worked out. Most of my poems were written and published before I was married. So most of them were written in my 20s. And I was married when I was 30, which was the same year that Dragon Claw came out. And so it was just, I think, that my publishers and I thought that Forsyth was a much better kind of writing name.
Yeah.
I've actually never liked my maiden name. I was teased specifically all through my childhood. Everyone used to sing the Humphrey B. Bear theme song. I came I was quite glad not to actually have that name anymore because it was part of my childhood bullying experience. So I just felt, and I've always loved, Forsyth is a beautiful name, so I was quite happy to use it.
Well, I'd like to say that your maiden name is nowhere near as bad as my maiden name, which is going to remain a state secret. Because it would cause too much hilarity otherwise. Half your books have been for adults and half of them have been for children. How do you decide what age group a story is going to be written for?
Yeah, to me, it's always a very natural and intuitive thing. And as soon as I begin to think about a story, as soon as a story, is birthed into my imagination, I always know exactly who I'm writing for. I don't really consider it too much. I think that I always try and say, the story determines its own shape. The story determines its own audience. In a way, I'm always writing for myself in that, but I'm always writing for a kind of ideal reader. So me at 12, me at 16, me now, and for people who are like me, if that makes sense. And so always, I always know who I'm writing for. And it's got a lot to do with the age of the protagonist, how I imagine, because I have to imagine a story before I can write it. And I have a very visual imagination. So I see my characters in my mind's eye. And so I always know how old they are. It's not like I could, suddenly say, oh, that 12-year-old is now 16 because she's 12 in my imagination. And that is what predetermines the audience of each of the books.
Okay. Have you ever had a story start out being for children and then change to a story for adults or the other way around?
No, never. As I say, I always know who I'm writing for, and
Always.
the story always, I don't. The way that I work is that I think and wonder about the story and daydream about the story and imagine the story for a very long time before I start to write it.
Right.
And so quite often it's quite fully realised in my imagination before I begin to write it, or I don't start writing till I have a title, before I know the beginning, the middle, and the end, until I can see and hear my characters quite clearly. And so then when I begin to write, I feel much more in control of what I'm doing, and the story seems to flower so much more easily and swiftly. While I know other writers sometimes spend quite a long time writing before they get to, I call it the quickening. You know, when I start to hear and see my characters, and that's when I know I'm ready to write. But I think that other writers sometimes spend quite a bit of time trying to write until they get that quickening.
Mm. Yes, that's a really good way of putting it too. Um, you've been nominated for and you've won lots of awards. How do you think this has impacted on your career?
I think that things like awards are wonderful because they help a writer feel faith in what they're doing and confidence in what they're doing. I think that you know, writers are always struggling with, you know, the great demons of self-doubt and, you know, lack of faith in yourself or in your story. And so when you've won awards and you think, well, other people do think what I'm doing is good, therefore it, it, it gives you strength to go on. You need a great deal of courage to be a writer. I always think it's the most, you know, like I always say the three things a writer needs are obviously a vivid imagination, a love of words, and a great deal of courage. And so awards are like a reward for being brave. The other thing that it does, of course, is it helps build reputation. And when there are so many hundreds of thousands of writers working and writing and being published, there's this great clamour of names and stories, and it helps readers choose, you know, to read one person over another person. Mm-hmm. But it's the same with sales. You know, sales work in action. Once you're a best-selling author, then people go, oh, well, I've heard her name before. I've heard his name before. Lots of other people have liked their books. Perhaps I like them as well. And it's just another way of helping you build a career as an author.
Mm. Have you felt more pressure to perform after receiving these awards?
There's always pressure on best-selling and published authors to win new markets, to maintain sales, to continue a rigorous publishing schedule, at least, you know, one book a year, for example. And I certainly feel that sometimes once you've won an award, there's a sense that you should go on and win lots more. I actually think winning awards takes a little bit of pressure off an author because, you know, all you need to do is just win once. One award, and then forever after, you're an award-winning author. All you ever have to do is be on the New York Times bestseller once, and forever after, you're a New York Times best-selling author. So I actually think these things help take the pressure off of writers, help build market, help spread the word, and help maintain the faith in yourself as a.
How much do you think that faith in yourself is a barrier, or if you've got the faith in yourself, how much do you think it is a vehicle for continuing your work?
I think it is probably the key to having you know, to actually writing a novel in the first place. You know, to set out to write a novel is actually a very big thing and takes a lot of time, and you need to maintain it, you know, to maintain interest in your own work for so long when you have no hope of getting published. Then once you are published, then you need to maintain the faith in order to keep on working, keep on writing. You know, sometimes for very little financial reward. I actually think that, you know, having faith in yourself is very difficult. And so if you can have it and can use it and help driving you on, it's a great gift. When I teach writing, I find that self-doubt and the fear that you aren't good enough and the fear that other people won't like what you do are the chains that hold most creative artists back. And the only things that you can do to break those chains is have courage, have faith, and have persistence. So, you know, I think it's one of the keys to success.
Words of wisdom. You interview other authors about their work. As an author yourself, what's it like to be on the other end of the interview process?
Well, see, I love to read and I love to write. And when I'm not reading and when I'm not writing, I like to talk about reading or talk about writing and or think about reading or think about writing. I'm quite obsessive about books. I'm also very, very interested in creative processes and in the actual art and craft of writing. And the other thing is that I feel that other writers are kindred spirits. And so I love to reach out and meet other kindred spirits. There's nothing that makes me happier than reading a new book by an author I didn't know and then finding out they've got a backlist and there's hours of reading pleasure ahead of me. The other thing is that I know that for other writers, it can be very, very difficult to find an audience. And I know for readers, it can be very, very difficult to find books that you love to read. And so I see myself as being in this position of spreading the word about books that I love, writers that I love, and helping readers find good books and writers find good readers. And so it's just something that I really, really enjoy doing. I've interviewed, some of the most amazing writers in the world, and that just makes me so happy because I'm only 1 degree of separation now away from these people who I admire and respect so much. And I know as a fact that many people who love my books read my blog and read my newsletters and follow me on Goodreads because they see me as being a doorway into other writers and other books. So I often get emails from someone saying, thank you so much. I wouldn't have discovered this wonderful writer without you.
Wonderful. You're teaching, but you're also doing a doctorate in fairy tale retellings.
I am. I'm about a little over halfway through my doctorate at the moment. So my most recent novel, which is this beautiful tomb, Bitter Greens, that was the creative component of my doctorate. It's a retelling of the Rapunzel fairy tale. Then my theoretical aspect of my doctorate is simply studying Rapunzel. I'm going to be a doctor of fairy tales, which I just love the thought of that. It's just so fey and so frivolous and so unusual, so impractical.
Normally I'd ask you, are you going to get the puffy hat? But in this particular case, do you get a pair of wings when you graduate?
I hope some little fairy ones and some fairy dust and a little tiara. I might turn up to my my presentation dressed up as a fairy.
Well, I'd love to have some pictures of that. What can you tell us about, well, you've already talked a little bit about Bitter Greens. Would you like to talk a bit more about Bitter Greens and your latest novel for children, The Starkin Crown?
Absolutely. So the Bitter Greens took me about 7 years to write and research because it was you can probably see it's quite thick. It's got 170,000 words in it. So it's quite substantial. I have wanted to write a retelling of Rapunzel since I was quite a small child. I first read the fairy tale when I was about 7, and then I read a few fairy tale retellings. There was The Glass Slipper by Eleanor Farjeon, which I adored. There was The Stone Cage by Nicholas Stewart Gray, which I adored. There were a few others. There was Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis, which is a retelling of the Cupid and Psyche myth. And that told me that it was possible to get inside a fairy tale and retell it from a different point of view and somehow illuminate the fairy tale. I went on, I majored in children's literature in my first degree, and I studied fairy tales then. So we did Bruno Bettelheim and, The Uses of Enchantment and books like that. And so all this time I was thinking, I always knew it was going to be Rapunzel, always. But I had other books to write, and I did my master's, other things to do. And I think it was because I was waiting till I was I was big enough, old enough, wise enough, had enough of a grasp of the craft of writing to tackle such a difficult story. A lot of people, when I was telling them, they'd say, "Oh, Kate, what are you working on?" And I go, "Oh, I'm doing a retelling of Rapunzel," and they would either think it was a children's book or that it was a very serious kind of academic book. Mm. And I'd say, no, it's this amazing story of love, desire, obsession. It's a bit of a bodice ripper, and that is really what it's like, because the woman who first wrote the tale, Charlotte Rose de la Force, was the most fascinating woman. She was cousin to the Sun King, Louis XIV. She had a very scandalous life at the court of Versailles in Paris. She was banished to a convent when she was about the same age that I am now, because of her wild and wicked ways. And she wrote Personette, which was the first true version of Rapunzel, while she was locked away in a convent. So my book, Bitter Greens, is really about her. It tells her life story intertwined with a retelling of Rapunzel. So, it was very research intensive. It took me a very, very long time to find out about Charlotte Rose de la Force, because she was just nothing but a kind of lost footnote, to history. And her life was incredible, but no one knew it. So it was such a gift to a novelist.
Oh, it sounds wonderful. One of the issues that comes out in Rapunzel is it's very much, history is his story, but in this particular case, you've changed it and it becomes her story.
Yes, one of the things that I'm always interested about is I guess, female power. It's a theme that runs through all of my books to a certain degree. A lot of my heroines are fighting to have a voice and fighting for self-determination. History, of course, is a history of, the repression of female desire, female creativity and female self-determination. And so I've always been interested in helping, women in the past, find a voice and tell their own story. This is more true of Bitter Greens than it is of any of my other books, because this is very much dealing with a real life woman who really lived and really had exactly those kind of struggles. She was sent to a convent to shut up, basically, and to stop her from living the life that she wanted to live. And the triumph of her life is that while she was locked away, she wrote a collection of fairy tales that helped start the big fairy tale craze of the 17th century. She was the original Madame X. She published anonymously, and she was able to buy her way out. She was able to buy her own freedom because her books sold so well that she actually made quite a lot of money out of them. So I just loved her story, and I love the fact that I was able to examine those things that really interest me through her story.
And it was a very interesting, I ended up wondering at the end, how much of Charlotte's story was actual fact? Like, was it all fact? How much did you extrapolate from the historical records?
Everything that happens in the book is true, in that, she really did dress up as a dancing bear to, gain access to her imprisoned lover. She really did, dabble in witchcraft, and she really did, try and cast a spell on a marquis to make her marry her. However, I was drawing upon court gossip, so I was reading all the letters and diaries of 17th century aristocratic French women, and quite often it would be a line. For example, I have a scene where Charlotte Rose is locked up in the Bastille and is interviewed by the French Inquisition. So in the history books, it simply says, and then Charlotte Rose de la Force came to the attention of the king. 5 words, came to the attention of the king due to her involvement with the witches of Alice. And so out of that, I had a wonderful scene, being a prisoner in the Bastille, being interviewed, everything else. I don't know if she was ever actually in the Bastille. It's pretty unlikely that she was, because she was still cousin to the king. But many, many other women were thrown in the Bastille around this time. About 86 were executed for witchcraft during those years, and many of them were aristocratic women. So, I embellish a little.
And the most outrageous facts, like the dancing bear, are facts.
That was the thing that first made me interested in Charlotte Rose de la Force. So I was reading an article about the French fairy tale, contributors or fairy tale tellers, and a biographical note about her said she was a scandalous woman. She caused a great scandal by dressing up as a dancing bear, and I thought, how amazing, how fabulous in such a strict patriarchal society where women had no legal rights whatsoever, and here she was, her younger lover was locked away in the castle by his family. She couldn't get into him, and so she hired a troupe of actors and acrobats, and they went and performed at the castle, and her face was very well known, so she dressed up as a dancing bear in a bear skin. I mean, how brilliant. Loved it. So that was a moment that I knew I had to write about her, because, I would like to think that I would have that chutzpah, that courage to do that sort of thing. Why not,
Absolutely, me too. What would you like to tell us about the Starkin Crown?
The Crown. This is my most recent children's book. I'll just hold it up so you can see it. Very attention-grabbing cover. The Starkin Crown, I think, is the third in the series of heroic fantasy for children and young adults. And the first book in that series is The Starkin Tree, which was my first children's book. Now, when I was a child growing up wanting to be a writer, I wanted to write like the authors that I admired so much, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien, Enid Blyton and Susan Cooper, all these great fantasy writers and adventure writers. And so even though my first 8 books were for adults, I'd always wanted to write for children. And so I set out to write the kind of book that I had most loved reading, ones that had secret passageways and ones that had, magical creatures and monsters and were full of suspense and surprise and mystery and just a little bit of romance. And so that's the kind of book that I really wanted to write. So I just poured everything into it that I had loved to read when I was a child, in the hope that other people would like that as well. And of course they do. I think if you write, I think it's really important when you're writing a genre like fantasy that you are really sincere in your passion for it. You don't set out to write it because you want to, tap into a market, or because you think it's easy to write, or any of these reasons why people write it. I think you've really got to love it, and you've really got to love its motifs and its memes and its structures, and you really have to understand, I think, how it works on a number of different levels. And so that's what I did. I just tried to write a book that I would have liked to have read when I was 12.
Fantastic. Now, you were talking earlier about you've just been through a really busy time. You've been writing Wild Girl. What can you tell us about Wild Girl?
Well, The Wild Girl is, interestingly enough, a book that rose out of my research for Bitter Greens. When I first set out to write Bitter Greens, I wanted to retell Rapunzel, and I wanted to have a flame story. Someone telling the story of Rapunzel as if it had really happened. I actually initially imagined it would be told by Rapunzel as an old woman to the Grimm brothers, because I thought of Rapunzel as being Grimm brothers' story. then when I actually went back and did my research, I realised that it wasn't at all. The Grimm brothers had simply recorded an earlier story, and that was a story told by Charlotte Rose de la Force. And that was how I discovered Charlotte Rose de la Force, and how she ended up becoming so much more than a frame story to my retelling of the Rapunzel fairy tale. But while I was doing that research, I actually was researching the origins of the Grimm brothers stories. And I just stumbled across this extraordinary story. Basically, when people think of the Grimm brothers, they think of them as being old and sort of, all dressed up in kind of medieval outfits. And they imagine them travelling all around Germany and collecting stories from little old women hunched over their wheels and old, blind men with their sheep out on the hills. And, that's how people think the Grimm brothers. And actually, that's so untrue. The Grimm brothers were not in medieval times. They were in the early 19th century. So they were living at the same time as Jane Austen and Laura Byron and all the, they were living during the Napoleonic Wars. And they were very, very poor. They couldn't afford to travel around. Another thing was their country, which was Hessen Castle, was one of the first kingdoms to fall to Napoleon. And so they were in the centre of this incredible, war, in times of war and famine. And so they collected, their stories from the people who lived around them. And one girl, his name is Dorchen Wilde, she lived next door to the Grimm brothers. She was best friends with their little sister Lottie, and she was the source of about 1/6 of all of their tales. And she grew up next door to them and told them some of the most amazing tales. She told them Rumpelstiltskin. She told them Hansel and Gretel. She told them Six Swans, which is another one of my favourite tales. She told them the Elves and the Shoemaker. She told a very bloody and gory version of Bluebeard, except that in her version, the girl saves herself and her sisters. While in the Bluebeard that we know, which was told by Perrault, the girl saved by her brothers. I could go on and just tell you all the stories that she told, but what intrigued me most about it is that she told these tales to William Grimm when she was 19 and he was 24. And then they ended up marrying. So he was like the great true love of his life. And then she lived with Jacob and Willem and cared for them and looked after them until they were old men. And she was always helping them with their work. And it's just a really beautiful love story. And that, of course, appealed to me. He had all the things that I love. You have the forgotten woman. You have the storyteller, a woman's voice being taken over by men. You have a time of strife and trouble and war. I'm always drawn to the most turbulent periods in history. And then you have this beautiful love story. And as a romantic, what more could I ask for? So that is how I came to write Wild Girl.
Sounds beautiful.
Mm.
Your books tend to be large, so much so that you commented on your website that Wild Girl is larger than you expected, but this is normal. What do you feel that the big epic read offers readers more than a slimmer volume would?
Well, I have a couple of things to say. The first thing is I actually love, those kind of slim and utterly perfect books that, you just read them and there's not a word out of place, and you finish them with that sting of tears in your eyes, that lump in your throat. I would love to be able to write like that. That's, but that's just not how my imagination works. All of my books tend to be big. They all tend to be epic. They all have very strong plots because I'm interested in story and in the telling of stories. They tend to have big canvases and lots of characters. And I really love reading those books as well. For me, books have always been like magical gateways. And when I'm reading a book, I want to completely immerse myself in that book. I want to forget who I am. I want to forget where I am in my own world. I want to finish a book and come out at the far end a little bit dazed and confused and as if I'm not quite sure who I am and where I am because I've been so engaged in that reading experience. And so that is, I think, what I try and give my readers, is that same sense. I call it the voluptuous abandonment into a story, total immersion into a story. Why my imagination works this way, I cannot tell you. It's just the way that I think to work, and I think you have to know your own strengths and know your own weaknesses, and do what is intuitively right for you. And so that's what I try and do.
What do you see as your major mythological and legendary influences, and what drew you to them?
Oh, that's the big question. My mother was an anthropologist, and so I was brought up in a house that was, and my father was a scientist. So there was a lot of argument and discussion, and I was brought up on a very strong sense of mythology. For example, I was given a copy of the Greek myths for my 12th birthday. For my 16th birthday, I was given Man and His Symbols by Jung. It was just very much a part of our natural household. I was also brought up in a family of storytellers, and my grandmother and my great aunts were of Scottish ancestry. So I was very much brought up on Celtic myth and Celtic folklore, and I think that really fed into my imagination as well. The stories that I was always drawn to were always stories of myth, history, and fairy tale, and they're the ones that I have always loved to read. And the books that have been read to rags on my bookshelf, because I read books over and over and over again. They're all the ones, retellings of Starkin, for example, or all sorts of different types of stories like that.
You're actually sitting in your writing room, I believe.
I am. This is where I work. It's very messy at the moment because, as you said before, I've just come out of a very intense work period. But, excuse me, someone at my door. That'll be my children or my dogs. I'm not sure which one. So yeah, this is where I work. I sit here at my study and I look over the garden to the ocean, which I find very beautiful and very inspiring. I have behind me, that's the bookshelf that has all of my books on. I don't know if you can see that.
Yes, I can.
And if I turn around, they're all my reference books. So I have maybe 2,000 books here in my study, with beautiful titles like Book of Poisons, Fire Burn, A History of Witchcraft, the Book of Curses. I think people who came into my study might get quite worried.
So it's just a little bit of light reading for you.
I do a research on my books, all of my books, but particularly the historical novels. I love to immerse myself totally in a historical period before I write about it, and I like to know everything that there is to know. So each time I write a book, particularly one like Wild Girl or Bitter Dreams, which is very, historical, well, I just do a great deal of reading. But I love to read. I love to research. It's part of the process. It generates ideas, and I think it helps me feel in control of my period.
Yes, it's so important to get that real genuine resonance.
I think so. I always think my readers are very intelligent and well educated, and so I would hate to ever think that I could just make something up and think they would pick it up, because most readers, I think, know when a writer hasn't done their research and know when a writer is not totally immersed in a period. I think they can tell. So it's a matter of trusting my reader and having respect for my reader that I do the best job I possibly can. If that makes sense.
Yes, it does. You seem to have become a regular at Sydney Supernova. Are you going to do the rounds and visit the rest of Australia as well?
I would absolutely love to. My big problem is that I have 3 children, and so the travelling part of the job is something that's very, very difficult for me. As the children are getting older, it's getting easier for me. So next year I'll have 2 in high school and 1 in primary school. And so obviously the older they get, the easier it is for me to travel. But I have to pick and choose where I go and what I do. I try and not be away more than once a month. And I try not to be away on too many weekends, because weekends here, I spend my weekends driving my children around to all their sports and social activities. And if I'm not here, it's really hard on my husband, because we've got 3 children and there's only 2 of us. So, I just had to be really careful, to balance family and work. The actual writing is fine because I do it at home, and so I'm here all the time. But, research trips are very, very important, so I tend to put those first. For example, I was overseas for 3 weeks earlier this year. I was in Germany to research Wild Girl, and I was also in the UK just to see my publishers and agents, and I was giving the keynote address at a conference on film fantasy at the University of Chichester. So that was obviously really important to me, and so I chose to do that instead of coming to Melbourne. I'm sorry.
We'll forgive you, but we'll hold out hope that you come and visit us soon.
I would love to, and I do try and, make sure I get to each of the capital cities every couple of years. But I know, anyone that has a young family knows how hard it is to get away from them, and also how much they need their mum. And also, they're growing up so fast already. I don't want to miss out on these years. So I just have to do my best to keep all the balls in the air and be fair to my family.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for talking to us, Kate.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And I hope you have a lovely rest of your afternoon.
Yes, you too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.